science session focused on childhood cancer, and I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Richard Clapp. I've been looking for an opportunity to have Dr. Clapp come to Alaska for a long time now, but he's been such a great resource for communities, offering his epidemiological expertise for so many years, and I so much appreciate his work. He was the founder and director of the Massachusetts Cancer Registry in the Department of Public Health. He joined Boston University School of Public Health, and he is now officially retired, although it doesn't look like he's very retired at this point. But he has a lot of great expertise in the health effects of environmental exposures to radiation and toxic chemicals, and we are very pleased to welcome him. And Rosemary Ahtuangaruak is back here because she is going to offer a community perspective from her wealth of experience living on the North Slope and some concerns about a cluster of childhood cancers. Thank you. Thank you both.
Well, Pam has given me the opportunity to visit this state for the first time. So I grew up in Maine, and we have mountains and rivers and so forth in Maine, but I went to Seward yesterday, not like this, and it was a pleasure to see your state for the first time. It was on my bucket list, so now I can check that off. And I also wanted to sort of do what David Carpenter did, which is I had prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm basically going to try to go through it quickly or maybe ignore most of it and tell a story about citizen empowerment, because I think that's really the spirit of what we're doing here today. I should also say, as I think Carol said, which is that I'm on East Coast time, so I understand some of you need a nap right now. So do I, but if I fall asleep, that's my fault, not yours. So, and then, as Carol did, I have to show a slide that says, here's what I'm going to say. This is what they train us academics to do. There's a guy at Boston University School of Public Health who said, he gave us a lecture to faculty as to how to do lectures, and he said, you can take a scintillating, really interesting presentation and turn it into something dull and lifeless with PowerPoint. So I'm going to try not to do that, but I will go through it quickly. So let me start with a few things about what we now know about parental, occupational, and environmental factors, or parental and environmental factors, but the parental are mostly the occupational exposures, as often is the case. Workers are exposed more than anybody in the production of some of these new chemicals that we've been talking about today. But the genetic factors, the heritable factors that are due to something that's passed on year after year, are relatively few, very few actually, in childhood cancer. There's one that's called the Li-Fraumeni syndrome, and that's actually a series of childhood cancers that are typical in families that have these particular defects to the spell checker gene. It's called P53. So that's been known for a while. I mean, it's a famous syndrome, and it does result in cancer families, but it's a very small portion of the total cancer burden. And then likewise, something called the RB gene. RB stands for retinoblastoma. You have to have 2 copies of that, one from each parent, in order for that to result in a childhood, eye cancer. It's a cancer of the retina, terrible thing to be born with, but it actually is treatable. They call it enucleation, meaning they take the eye out, but then you can survive that. And that's a genetically inherited type of cancer, very rare, thank God, or maybe thank the goddesses. I'm not sure quite how to say that these days. But in any case, those are well-known heritable childhood cancers. And I'll say later that they represent maybe 10% or at the most 20% of childhood cancer. So the rest is environmental, as the previous speaker noted. It's things outside the body, and that can include a whole range of things, even prenatal exposures. Parental occupational exposures have been linked to childhood leukemia if the parents, and this is both parents, mothers or fathers, were exposed to solvents, pesticides, and motor vehicle exhaust. I'm going to cover a lot of territory with these bullet points, but there's references about all of it. If any of you are interested in getting deeper into it, there's a very good review article I'll mention The bottom of this page has a review that was done about 13 years ago by colleagues of mine at UMass Lowell. So in any case, this is going to go by a lot of information quickly, and then I want to tell a story. So parental occupational exposures have also been linked to childhood brain and central nervous system cancers. And again, if the parents were exposed to solvents, pesticides, and other hydrocarbons. So that's all fairly secure in the literature. Depends on who you ask, how secure. But my view is those things have been shown and they have been repeated enough in epidemiologic studies that they stand up. Here's some more about environmental exposures. Now, these are not necessarily parental, but children exposed to solvent-contaminated drinking water. The way I learned about that was because of the childhood leukemia cluster in Woburn, Massachusetts. And then a sort of repeat of that same thing, childhood cancer in relation to solvent-contaminated drinking water in Toms River, New Jersey. Basically found the same thing, prenatal exposure to the kids because the mothers were drinking contaminated water while pregnant resulted in an increased risk subsequently of childhood leukemia, and at least in those two towns. And then a third example of that occurred at a military base. And air pollutants, environmental air pollutants now, and this is something really in the last 10 years that has become more secure, is that environmental air pollution and living near highly trafficked streets seems to be related to increased risk of childhood leukemia from the environmental exposure, breathing in air pollutants. And then environmental and residential exposure to pesticides and even pest strips, the things that pull down and when you hang them in your house to catch the flies. Exposure to that and household pesticides seems to increase the risk of childhood brain cancer. There's a whole lot of other sort of less secure or less convincing associations in the literature, but they're all summarized in this article at the bottom by Buka. She's the first author, and co-authors in a review that was published in 2007, which is actually, I think, the best single source I've seen on these environmental and occupational risk factors for childhood cancer. And so if you want, I have that somewhere here on my laptop, but you can look it up on Scholar Google or whatever source you use. So without belaboring those, there's a lot of information there, but those are the ones that I think are the most secure. I should say that there's one other resource, which will be on a handout that the next speaker, Madeline Scammell, after our panel, the next speaker will say, and it's a online resource called The Story of Health, A Story of Health. It was done by Dr. Ted Shetler, who some of you have, I'm sure, met. Somebody just raised their hand as if they know him well, and colleagues. And it's online at a website that's sponsored by the University of California and also the Centers for Disease Control. For those of you who are healthcare providers and you need continuing medical education credits, you can get them from doing this online source and taking, I guess you take a quiz at the end. And it's also done in a way that it's accessible to non-physicians. And so it's a very useful summary of the literature, and it basically says, especially about childhood leukemia, it says the things that I just said. We're also looking at teen cancer. I should first say that the most common, you can probably tell, the most common cancers in children under the age of 15 are acute lymphocytic leukemia, brain and central nervous system cancer, neuroblastoma, which is a tumor of the nerves of the sympathetic nervous system, so it's different from brain, but it's another neurogenic cancer, and then Hodgkin's lymphoma, and then down from that, several other types. But the most common in that age group, under age 15, are leukemia, especially acute lymphocytic leukemia, and brain and central nervous system cancer. And in the year 2014, it was estimated by the American Cancer Society that there were 10,450 cases countrywide in that age group. So it's very rare. I mean, there were 1 million cases of 1.6 million cases of cancer altogether in that year, but 10,000 of those were in those age below 15. And then the teen cancers, which is 15 to 19 as we look at it, those age 15 to 19 really haven't been looked at very much. But again, they're childhood. I mean, it's not like people have hazardous jobs where they're exposed to chemicals and get a cancer from it before they're 19. It's got to be something that they're exposed to perhaps even at an earlier childhood age or in the mother's womb. So that's worth looking at. It's also a fairly rare age group for cancer. It's like the 0 to 4-year-olds. It's a cancer that has approximately the same rates, but a different composition. Different types of cancer make up the overall rate in teens. So it's something that we at UMass Lowell are trying to take a closer look at. And so in that age group, the most common are Hodgkin's lymphoma, thyroid cancer, and then brain and central nervous system cancer third, and then testicular cancer, testicular and germ cell, but it's mostly in boys, so it's testicular cancer. Those are the leading ones in the teen years. So again, we need to look at that. It's countrywide 5,330 cases in the year 2014 by the American Cancer Society estimates. It's a tiny fraction of the overall burden, but it's it's an age group, the whole childhood age group is of critical importance to us for all the reasons that we've been talking about. This is the slide that Ruth already showed. I was thinking, all of this stuff basically has already been said today, so I'm kind of just repeating some of it. But this is the pattern of cancer incidence going up year by year since 1975, and it's not abating. It's overall cancer for adults is beginning to level off, and in males it's especially because of the decline in lung cancer. And in females, it's a combination. Some of the decline is in breast cancer, so the big ones in adults are beginning to level off, but not in children. This picture continues to worry everybody. And then this is another version of the treatment story, which is that deaths due to cancer in kids are coming down as a rate. This is the graph of the rate of childhood cancer mortality in the US up through 2014. And it's just looking at a little bit shorter time window, but it's basically a consistent downward trend. So some of these cancers, like particularly childhood leukemia, can be treated in a way that doesn't cause death, at least not during the teenage years. But people still live as teenage cancer survivors, and even more so as childhood cancer goes up and mortality due to childhood cancer goes down. That means there are more people in here that are living with cancer that maybe in previous years would have been dead, but it's a burden. It's a burden on them, it's a burden on their families. So that's the goal of this, is to reduce that burden or prevent that burden, ideally. So again, we've talked about this a bit in UMass Lowell. Our colleagues have submitted a journal article. It'll be in the journal Pediatrics later this year, I think in November. And so we call people to take a look at this, teenage cancer as a sort of unexamined trend that's also worrisome. I took a look at Alaska Native, cancer in Alaska Native children, and I think this reflects what Vi especially was saying earlier, is that there is a story here, and Dr. Ann Lanier told it, at least up until the year 2003, I guess was her publication, and it's a story that has public health significance. And so it's a way that the science actually does confirm what people are saying and seeing in their communities. And that is that childhood cancer in Alaska Natives is going up. There's one type that seems to be even higher in Alaska Natives than anywhere else, in the US at least, and that's liver cancer in children. Very rare in general, but especially rare in children, but not so much rare in Alaska Native children. This article, by the way, has a lot of detail about even regional differences within Native Alaskan populations. So for those that want to dive deeper into that, I recommend Ann Lanier's paper. And so here's some conclusions. Like I said, I wanted to go through this quickly and then tell a quick story. So childhood cancer is steadily increasing. It's not coming down. Mortality is coming down. Childhood cancer incidence, that's being diagnosed with it, is going up. Dying from it is coming down. It's still a second leading cause of disease death in kids. So there are a lot of other things that are not diseases, like motor vehicle accidents, that cause death in kids. But for diseases, cancer is actually still the leading disease cause of death in children. 1 out of 208, this is national statistics, 1 out of 285 children will be diagnosed before the age of 20 years of age. And then 1 in 530 adults aged 20 to 39, and this is the people who are living with it, some of whom were diagnosed earlier and are still alive with it in their age 20 to 39. So that's 1 out of 530 adults. So it's rare, but it's not unheard of. We all probably know such people. And this is the measure of the burden, as I said. And so here's some sort of perfunctory recommendations. More research is needed. Researchers always say that, and they often say more research by me is needed, but I think it is true that some of these, as I said, some of these less common associations need to be seen again before we really believe them, but there's plenty to act on already, and so more research would help that. Only 20 or less, 10 to 20% are actually hereditary. There's not much you can do about that. As Charlotte said, you can't change your genes. And then reduction of carcinogenic exposures to parents, the developing fetus, newborns, and young children will prevent some of this. I'm also part of the group that's working on a cancer-free economy or pushing toward a cancer-free economy. We have an example of that we think makes total sense, which is dry cleaning clothes with chemicals. This tetrachloroethylene, 4-chlorine, 2-carbon molecule. That's the most common use, that's the most commonly used chemical for dry cleaning. We don't need to do that. We don't need to use that. That chemical causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, bladder cancer, and probably a couple of others. We don't have to clean clothes that way. It doesn't have to expose the workers who do that cleaning, and it doesn't have to expose people who bring the dry cleaning home and hang it up in their closets, and then it's off-gassing into the house. None of that is necessary because there's an alternative that's readily available. This is the precautionary principle. It's not a big leap. It's called wet cleaning. It's basically steam. And the methods of doing that are in hand. It's not like it has to be invented. So we feature that as an example. We can have a cancer-free economy. Here's a little case example of that by cleaning clothes by either just washing them or using a dry cleaning process that doesn't use chemicals. And then lastly, I'll say a little bit about the term green chemistry, and I'm not sure that we mentioned that yet today, but green chemistry is the way of thinking about how does nature do this? Or how can we do this in a way that doesn't disrupt natural processes and natural rhythms or disrupt other species? And so the green chemistry is sort of a field within the field of chemistry where people are trying to figure out how to do that. And one term has been coined by one of the founders of this field. It's called biomimicry. Let's try to imitate nature or even use nature, and using adhesive that plants use to climb up walls or that animals use to be able to go up vertical. That kind of adhesive is a natural thing. It's not something that has to be created by, say, DuPont or some chemical company and sold at necessarily the profits. So in any case, green chemistry is a way out of this, and so is alternatives assessment. And I would say that's really implementing the precautionary principle is if we know enough about a chemical to say we shouldn't be using that, we need to figure out how to do something else that gets the same result, that's not a regrettable substitution, and that's called alternatives assessment. And both of those fields are beginning and growing, and colleagues of mine are working on both of those. So it's not a hopeless situation, and there is a way out of this, and here's two of them at the bottom of this slide. So that's all of the dull and boring PowerPoint that I wanted to show you. I just wanted to give one example of empowered people and how empowered people have actually forced this agenda. And it's a military-based example, and it's Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, which is the East Coast place where Marines get their basic training. And so there's a ATSDR, and somebody also mentioned, I think Vi mentioned, that there are some heroic people in the agencies. Well, there's one at ATSDR whose name is Frank Beauvais. He's an unsung hero. We gave him the Ozanoff Award at Boston University. Dave Ozanoff is our former chair, and it's for people who work within public agencies, serving the public good, and don't get recognized for it. So we gave the Ozanoff Award to Frank Beauvais, mostly because of his work in response to the Marines and their families, the Marine retirees. I sometimes say ex-Marines. There's no such thing as an ex-Marine. They may be retired Marines, but they're still Marines. And they had a group of them They had their own website called The Few, the Proud, the Forgotten. And so they started gathering information about people who had ever been at Camp Lejeune. I point at the screen as if it's up there, but it's in North Carolina. And it's 500,000 people went through there during a period when the water was severely contaminated with solvents, with especially trichloroethylene, but also perchloroethylene, the dry cleaning solvent. And so they knew that something was wrong amongst their members. They got enough response to their website that they became a pressure point to get ATSDR/CDC and the Department of Navy to study their health and to come up with an answer. Is this killing us? Is it we think it is, or actually as we know it is? You know, do the studies that show this, and then we'll go to Congress and get, them to pass a law to compensate. And it took about 15 years for that process that I just described to happen. There was a community assistance panel established by ATSDR that met. I was a member of that for the 10 years from when it first started in 2006 until earlier this year. And it was an amazing process. I mean, partly because these were indefatigable people that were leading it, and they just would not take no for an answer. And in fact, they wouldn't take no for an answer from the Navy or the Marine Commandant, who were saying things that people have mentioned earlier, oh, there's nothing wrong, or, if there is, there's nothing we can do about it now, so go away. They wouldn't take that as an answer. And so the Community Assistance Panel was an incredibly effective grassroots, in this case, Marine family-based, Marine retirees and their families-based advocacy effort that succeeded. It doesn't always go like this. In fact, more often it doesn't go like this. But I just want to tell you that there is an example of citizens determining that there is a problem, insisting that a government agency do something to document it, and then they literally did go to Congress, and Congress passed an act to, you can't sue the government, so you have to get Congress to appropriate money, but they got that, believe it or not, from the US Congress in a bipartisan way to compensate family members who had a list of diseases that were linked to these two chemicals that were the exposure. I keep pointing to it, but it's not there. They did have a list from the scientific literature of what diseases were likely caused by these chemicals, and sure enough, the Congress passed a law that listed those, or actually ordered the Department of Navy to find those, to make that list. And they are now compensating family members who are not compensated otherwise, like through the VA or some other system. So it can be done, it was done. There's a movie about it, it's called Semper Fi. Semper Fi - always faithful, that's the English translation of what Semper Fi means. And there's a book called A Trust Betrayed that document all of this. So I commend that to you, and those of you who are advocates, keep the faith. That's my story, and I'm gonna stick to it. Thanks.
Thank you for your words and sharing all that information. It's so very helpful. I step back into a different light. As community health aides in our villages, we're taught how to do a physical exam. In my village, I was the first health aide that was taught before I took the job. Many of my predecessors took the job and were taught how to care for our patients over time as our people came in the door. We're taught to be the hands, eyes, and ears of the physician who may come out to the village 3 or 4 times a year. But it's our health aides that are really providing the care for our people. We're taught how to examine the body. We're taught to put our hands on the body and feel the different parts. We're taught to look and see, and we learn what's normal, and we learn to describe what is abnormal. Oftentimes, we don't know why it's abnormal, but after you've seen a number of people, you can tell it's not right. So you talk to your physician over the phone and you tell them about these people that come into your village clinic. You provide questions from our manual that ask some basic set of questions that might help us come up with an answer to why people are having trouble. A lot of times we don't have answers. But we work as our elders before us have taught us. Our elders before us had techniques of tradition and culture, of ways of touching and healing our bodies from being taught from our elders before us. We're taught to move the internal organs. We're taught to relieve pressure points that are building up tension and to relieve pain. Some of us are taught different techniques on letting go of what they call the bad blood. These things are very important, but it's not what we're taught in Western medicine. It's not the same thing. It's a big void that's become new science in medicine. People, it's hard to go in and get care as our elders taught us, because now they have all of this technology. They want to stick you with a needle. They want to do these blood tests. They want to run these x-rays. They want to do all these other things. In our villages, we still don't have that. We rely on our hands, our eyes, our ears to share concerns from our people. I remember the first time I felt an abnormal finding in a small boy, 15 months old. I had just gone through community health aid training, and this little boy had come in for an earache. But I was taught to do a full exam, so I felt his belly, and I felt this fullness that wasn't normal. And I brought it to my coworker who was teaching me how to do the physical exam, and he says, "You're right, it does feel kind of funny." This little boy had a stomach cancer, and he was sent down to Children's Hospital. I followed because I wanted to further my education. I completed my training as a community health aide. I went through the 3 sessions that at the time we were taught, 3 training sessions, and then you go to a preceptorship. And I wanted to bring this education back to our community, but I found I had so many more questions. I didn't have enough answers from our community health aid training manual, so I went to the University of Washington to become a physician assistant. But I learned that even as a small community health aide in a small village of 500 people, we can educate others about what's going on with our people. When I went to the university, they told me a baby could not be delivered in the placenta. I had just done that in our small village. I stood up and I told the practitioner who was educating us, "You're wrong. I just delivered a baby in the placenta. I had to do CPR and help the baby come back, and the baby didn't survive very long, but the baby was alive when they got on the medevac." Others that are collecting data on the importance of our health do not know who and what we are. They do not have our statistics. They have numbers that have been generated through a process of collecting data. But just as a physician told me that I did not have to record every time a mother has a miscarriage, that's wrong. We need to know each and every time we have a problem with carrying a pregnancy through. We need to tie all these different numbers together to find out what's going wrong. I asked a lot of questions because in our small village we had people who were having trouble breathing. But when you have to stay up all night and help people breathe, and you don't have anyone else to turn the keys to so they can be on call the next day, you still have to open up your door to help the people that were sick the day before. You might have to send out your labs. You might have to get some medication off the plane. You might have to do a follow-up exam and follow up with a physician to communicate about that. But in our small villages, without being able to get the physician to hear the concern in our voices, to know how hard their families are worried about this person who has been coming back and forth to the clinic, and you don't have any answers for them. It's really hard, but we keep trying because we want to find those answers. But then you find out there are so many more questions that you have to keep asking, and we still don't have answers. I went and worked with some people on this national conversation on chemical toxins. It was a really important process to do so. One of the most important things that I could bring to that process was that a person who has concerns about their health must continue to ask questions. You might have a provider who does not give you an answer, but you keep knocking on doors and you keep asking those questions, because sooner or later, there's going to be enough questions asked that we're going to find an answer to your question. The process before us has many concerns. I worked so hard on the importance of tradition and culture and the health of our people, but I could not protect my small village of 500 from the National Energy Policy Act, because they want to develop every acre around my community because that's where oil and gas is. But we are a hunting and gathering and whaling culture, and the importance of continuing to be who and what we are is important beyond every layer of importance for other decision makers. We must continue to eat our foods and plants from our lands and waters. The costs for other foods brought to our region are beyond the hours per day that we may have hopes of gaining from income. But the importance of these issues place a burden on all of us, because we have these policies that are affecting change. I asked questions because people were having trouble breathing. But I didn't ask enough questions because I had 2 little babies in my village that developed leukemia in the same year after 23 days of flaring of oil and gas. I could not prevent the decision-making process that allowed salt water to be used to make an ice road and used on our tundra in the plants that it killed in this land that is so very important to our animals, because it was profitability that stayed at the decision-making table. I could not prevent a natural gas flare from being constructed within 3 miles of our new hospital. All of the importance of talking about importance of tradition and culture and life, health, and safety could not break through decision makers that had corporate interest of profitability at the decision-making table. I've seen stomach cancers, I've seen skin cancers, I've seen kidney and liver cancers, I've seen leukemia, I've seen stomach cancers, I've seen bone cancers. A small village of 500, you ask, how could we be seeing so many things when the doctors on the phone say, you're such a small village, it can't be that. But yet these things are occurring. The decision-making prophet has to take into account the health of our people and the future of our generations, and not just the profitability of the jobs that may come from changing our lands and waters. As a health aide, I worked only 14 years, and I saw many cases of cancer. But my niece has now taken over working in our village clinic, and she's only had 7 years, but she's seen 3 times the amount of cancer cases that I have seen. She suffered with those 2 little boys that developed leukemia and the loss of one. We all suffered in that loss. The process before us must continue to build the importance of the individual's health. We have a system of health care, but it's not meeting our needs. We must raise these standards for the future generations. All of us are here to do good work, but not everyone is there to do good research and good work. But we must work in the process before us. Our communities must own the research and the data points. Our research cannot be used against us in the guise of traditional ecological knowledge owned research by others that manipulates the data to be used against us. That's not acceptable. But I've spent the last few years defending against our own traditional ecological knowledge. We must be engaged in this process for the generations. It's got to be done in a multi-generational process. I took my granddaughter with me to the National Institute of Health and an institutional review board that worked on communities, disasters, and research, because she needs to see how hard I work in this process. She needs to meet some of these people that are working in these different issues, because the data sets that were collected on people in my age group, I'm fighting to access that data. It tells us about contaminants in our blood, but others have control of that data. That's not right. But the importance of my granddaughter's health concerns are a part of our history and the historical trauma of the past, decisions that have been made, and it's affecting all of our daily lives and the health of our children. You all know how important it is because you came to this important meeting today, and we must work together to change so that the policies and procedures that are the best practices are incorporated to be done in ways to affect the health of all of our future generations. Thank you.
Questions, comments, complaints, poems?
Where was that hand?
Okay, thank you for some informative talks. This is a question for Dr. Clapp. From your extensive review of the literature, what would you say are the top 5 chemicals that are suspected to being associated with childhood cancer?
Yeah, I think solvents as a group, I mentioned 2 in particular, trichloroethylene and tetraperchloroethylene. Pesticides, and again, as a group, but even particularly some pesticides, the ones that are on those no pest strips, seem to be associated with brain cancer. And then diesel exhaust and the components of diesel exhaust, not exactly sure which, but that's the nearest to the road finding. So I would list those, at least 2 solvents and pesticides as a group, and diesel exhaust. I'm not sure that's 5, I guess it's 4. The findings that in Woburn, Massachusetts and Toms River, New Jersey, were both prenatal exposure to trichloroethylene increased the risk dramatically, actually, 5 to 8 times in children that were exposed prenatally to trichloroethylene in the drinking water. I was talking about cancer, but yeah, actually there was a study of Camp Lejeune children. That's to say, the children of Marine family members that were born while living on base, and they found excess in those that were exposed to, it was tetrachloroethylene, did have higher rates of neural tube defects, which includes spina bifida, but just generally the category neural tube defects if they're exposed prenatally to perchloroethylene. And also increased childhood cancer, leukemia and lymphoma combined.
We've been talking about prenatal exposure and childhood exposure to chemicals, and I was wondering if you could comment on sort of more of that multi-generational effect, where there might be a grandmother or a mother exposed to a chemical, and then you see it, you know, in grandchildren. Like I know they had that with DDT and breast cancer with granddaughters.
I guess that was to me. The multi-generation, this is the kind of thing that's really hard to study in humans because it takes a long time to show up. So there are a lot of animal studies that address what you're talking about, grandparents and even second generation effects that suggest that both there may be damage to the genes of the germ cells, and also what's called epigenetic effects. This is another hot topic, which is it's not necessarily that the DNA itself was damaged, it's the ability of the gene to express its message has been silenced. It's called gene silencing or epigenetic effects, and those may go on beyond into multiple generations. But again, those studies are still underway in humans, and the best evidence right now is from animal studies.
I'm coming. I saw one down here and then one up here. Okay, where was the question down here?
Dick, could you talk some about how, in spite of the evidence in Woburn and Toms River, there wasn't the same happy ending as there was in Camp Lejeune, and also maybe something about what we're learning from the hallmarks of cancer, like how chemicals can, and other things can lead to cancer without being what we traditionally have thought about as carcinogens.
We're going to stay till 8 o'clock. Is that right? Is that the first question that Charlotte asked was about the not so happy ending in Woburn and Toms River. I think some of that is that Woburn in particular was kind of one of the early struggles around the ability of toxic chemicals that caused cancer in kids through drinking water. So. And there was a lawsuit filed. So while it was being studied, it went to court, and that tends to dampen community mobilizing, and that did happen in Woburn. And in Toms River, same thing, actually. It was later. It was in the late 1990s. The citizens group there, pressured the state, actually got Senator Lautenberg, that was up on the screen earlier. Senator Lautenberg got funding through the CDC budget to fund a study of childhood cancer in Toms River, New Jersey. And again, there was a lawsuit filed, and the lawsuit was settled literally like the day before the results of that study came out, showing that prenatal exposure had increased the risk of leukemia in kids. So you could argue both of those were like partial victories for the affected families, but not as much as the Camp Lejeune. I would say that was a nationally covered news story, really, about the fact, and now President Obama, when he was president, signed the law making it possible for families to get compensation. So and there was no lawsuit. As I say, you can't sue the US government. And then I think you're referring to the Halifax project, which came out, some of you know about this, in the last couple of years. A group of scientists in Halifax, Nova Scotia, got together to talk about small exposures to things that may even by themselves not cause cancer, but in the aggregate add up to something that does cause cancer. It's sort of like one way to talk about this is that every case of cancer has to have a completed pie with different slices in it, and each slice might by itself not be enough to cause the cancer, but when you add those all together, it does produce a cancer in a person. That's a kind of new understanding of low-level exposures to multiple things, including the chemical soup that we all live in and breathe and eat in our diets, add up. And the cumulative effect may be what's pushing the childhood cancer rates and other rates of certain cancers up. That's the very short version of what we're thinking now. This is, Charlotte mentioned the hallmarks of cancer. That's the name of a sort of important scientific article called The Hallmarks of Cancer that's just been updated, and that's what's led to this new thinking.
I have a comment. My name is Vi. I'd like to thank and commend Rosemary for sharing her story, her dedication and passion for her people, because these development corporations, they divide our communities, and it can get contentious in our communities. Most tribes are against development, and our for-profit corporations are. So, you know, I have a lot of respect for Rosemary, because that's not only on top of what we're facing in our communities, but what we're feeling and getting from our own communities. Even Annie Aloha, in the beginning, the tribe didn't want to support her because they thought it was too patriotic. But thank you.
I have a question for Rosemary also. I think you've probably more than most gone between the health practitioner in the community and at least training in traditional medicine. How do we go about getting more traditional knowledge available to the people in the rest of the world that don't know it, discount it, don't understand it, don't have any concept of it? I mean, it's clearly valuable for the communities, but there must be lessons learned that all of us need to know. And what's the mechanism of communicating that knowledge?
One of the biggest obstacles we have is that those that do research don't want to take the time that's necessary to truly do a good consultation process that allows us to work with obtaining our traditional ecological knowledge. If it's being done in the way that it should be done, you have to come with a proposal and communicate with our tribal community. Our tribal community has to receive your proposal. We have to look at what do we want to do within our tribal community on this issue. We have to look at, is there additional information that we need to go out and get? Talk to our traditional knowledge holders and bring some of this information in. Then we have to build and get a response just to prepare to communicate about this information that we've received in our next community meeting. Then we have to decide in that community meeting what is the response that we're going to have to do for that proposal that we've received. So you're talking just 3 months to do a basic interaction. The process should be done with us. I prefer that it goes through our tribes, because our tribes should hold our traditional ecological knowledge, but we have to hold this knowledge through the generations that are coming, because this data is going to be collected. But now with this newer technology, they want to absorb these data sets into new evaluations of research, but they want to take this data set from decades ago and say it's part of this research. But we have to be engaged in the process if you're going to be doing that, because we have to have our own interpretation of the data. We have to be looking at additional factors around our community that may affect in these data points. We have to be looking at the process and looking at what is it that you're bringing to us to communicate about, because if it's about a project, we have to look at the project and what kind of changes it's going to bring, so that we can make our own assessment to communicate about why you brought that proposal to us, and to interpretate that and bring it into the communication process. But we also have to really work at communicating within our own people, because we may have to do a translation of what you want in our own language. We have to look at identifying who it is that we want to contact within our tribal population to contribute to this process. We have to do a development of the report from those individuals, and we have to bring what we feel is important out of what they give to us to that specific project, but also look at what they've given to us and look at other projects that we may have to incorporate pieces of this data that we've received from this intervention or interview that we do, and if there's other projects that we have to incorporate that data also into. So it's really a complex process, but if you take the time and you work with us and you allow us to do the work that can be done within our ways, then we're going to contribute tremendously towards your report. And we give a light to the information that brings heart and soul into the process from our traditional knowledge and the stories of our usage, because it's not just about collecting a data point, it's about sharing the generations of usage and harvesting and sharing and protecting the health of our people into the generations.